She endured 100 whiplashes for being childless. Until a poor cowboy did this. The moonlit night was sharp as a blade over João's yard. The oil lamp quivered its glow, trembling while the wind dragged along the wooden fence. The crowd stood still, not a single breath dared too loud. The whip sliced through the air once, twice, then silence, heavy and hollow like a church without its bells. Maria Clara fell to her knees, her cheek pressed into the red dust, warm blood soaking in. The smell of damp earth and kitchen smoke filled her throat, and her prayer caught halfway in her chest. A strand of hair clung to her trembling lips. Such a small thing, yet enough to make every heart falter. Someone lowered their gaze, another turned away. Only the moon kept watching, unblinking. When João tossed the whip aside, leaving her abandoned in the cold yard, a man appeared on the dirt road beyond the fence. His shirt was worn thin, his back bent from labor. Step by slow step, he was walking forward, and with a single choice that poor cowboy would change the course of this night forever. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from today? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now, settle into a quiet place, breathe deep, and let the whispers of the Wild West carry you into tonight's tale. The wind swept endlessly through the town of Cold Creek in the year 1879. Red dust clung to the wooden steps, slipping through the cracks of the thin houses that lined the main road. From far away came the echo of hooves mingling with the weary creak of the general store's door, where a weak oil lamp cast its tired glow. In that little town, rumors traveled faster than the wind. A woman without children was not only pitied, she became the town's cruel jest, a shadow crushed beneath judgment. Maria Clara, barely past 20 once, had eyes that sparkled like a spring stream. Now they stayed lowered, avoiding every stare. She walked slowly through the market basket of vegetables in her arms while whispers trailed behind her barren. A house without children is a house without a soul. Her husband, John Whitfield, instead of shielding her, turned those words into weapons. At supper beneath the flickering lamplight, he let his sentences fall like stones. "What use is a wife who cannot give me a child?" The heavy scent of stew filled the air, but Maria Clara's throat closed tight, unable to swallow. In that moment, the audience hears the faint slice of a knife on the cutting board, the rush of wind against the walls, and the fragile breath of a woman unraveling inside her own home. The whole town turned its back, leaving a wife to live beneath the chill of an unseen curse. And it was within that harsh silence that destiny was preparing a meeting, one that would change her life forever. A meeting with a quiet cowboy, a man with eyes that knew how to listen, and a heart wide enough to shelter a forsaken soul. Part 1. Abandoned. Night fell over the barren land like a heavy curtain. The moon hung high but pale and dim as though cloaked by desert dust. A cold wind swept along the dirt road leading out of Cold Creek, carrying only the scattered chirp of insects and the hiss of wind lashing against wooden posts. Maria Clara dragged one step after another, her bare feet bleeding from stone and gravel. Her coarse cotton dress was smeared with dust and blood, its hem torn to shreds after the beating the whole town had watched in silence. Every breath cut her chest like a knife. Across her back, the whip marks burned and throbbed as if fire still licked beneath her skin. She tried to hold herself upright, but every muscle screamed. In her mind, the crack of leather echoed again and again, mingled with the murmurs of the crowd and the cold stares of neighbors who once shared salt at her table. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the chill of dry earth until her stomach turned. She stumbled against the trunk of an old tree by a broken fence. Her trembling hand clutched the rough bark, fingernails breaking as she tried to steady herself. The night sky spun above the moon, nothing more than a blurred streak of light. "Will I die here?" The thought passed through her, sharp yet strangely gentle, like a whisper of release. Then came the faces of her parents, the weathered skin of her father, his calloused hand brushing her hair when she was small, her mother's husky voice humming the lullabies of the old country. Her eyes blurred with tears. They slid down her dust-stained cheeks and dropped to the ground, darkening the soil as though burying pieces of her soul. She gasped, her lips trembling. No one came. The whole town knew she had been tied to the post, knew the whip had struck 100 times, yet no one had stepped beyond their doors. Judgment weighed heavier than chains. Maria Clara forced herself forward a few more steps. The road stretched endlessly, broken fences lining either side, the wind shrieking through the cracks like mocking laughter. She fell to her knees, hands pressing into the freezing dirt. In that moment, the familiar scent of night soil rose around her, the same scent that once meant peace when she ran barefoot in the garden as a child, her clothes warm with sunshine. Now that very scent reminded her that youth had been stolen, replaced with shame. She collapsed, her cheek pressed into the earth, listening to her heart stumble weakly. The world was so quiet, only the wind sighing through distant pines. An owl hooted, deepening the darkness. Maria Clara felt as small as a grain of sand, meaningless beneath the sky. The cold seeped into her skin, setting her body shivering. She wondered if come dawn her body would be left for the vultures before anyone thought to find her. The thought was terrifying, yet almost merciful. As faintness overtook her, memories returned in fragments. Her wedding day, the simple blue dress, the sparkle of hope in her eyes as she held John's hand before the church altar, those first nights together whispering of children of the future. She could still hear him promise someday we'll have a whole brood of little ones running through the yard. That promise now lay shattered, a shard of glass cutting her heart each time she touched it. The wind rose again, biting against her wounds until she trembled. Maria Clara shut her eyes tight, biting her lip until the taste of blood filled her tongue. "I didn't choose this pain," she whispered hoarsely. "It isn't my fault." Her voice was carried away unheard, swallowed by the night. Suddenly a sharp gust tore across the road, ripping the old scarf from her head. It fluttered into the ditch, carried by dust. She watched it go through blurred vision, then broke into sobs. That scarf had been her mother's gift, sewn on her wedding day with tiny stitches and pale violet flowers. Now, like her own life, it was swept away, abandoned in the dirt. Maria Clara crawled toward it, every motion like needles driving into her flesh. Her hand nearly reached the fabric when her strength gave out. She collapsed into the dry grass, its bitter scent filling her failing breaths. Her tears fell still, mixing with dust into a small patch of forgotten mud. Her father's voice echoed from long ago. "Daughter, you are not a tree planted in the square for all to cut. You are a seed of worth." His words now sounded like an echo from a distant mountain, faint and far away. She nodded weakly, whispering, "Father, I'm so tired." Her breaths came shallow, her eyelids too heavy to lift. Moonlight draped her trembling body, illuminating every bruise in shades of violet. The vast night swallowed her fading spirit. Yet somewhere at the far end of the dirt road, another sound stirred, distant, unfamiliar. At first only the crunch of gravel, then the steady rhythm of something heavier, hooves or wooden wheels. Maria Clara could not be sure, but her heart gave a single startled beat. She tried to lift her head, but her body was too heavy. All she could do was whisper one fragile plea, "Please don't leave me here." Her consciousness slipped into the dark, leaving her body still beneath the silent moon. The road stretched on the wind, still howled through broken fences. But out there in the shadows, the wheels kept turning steady and slow, and another lonely soul was moving closer, unaware that destiny had bound him to stop right here before the forsaken woman lying in the dust. Part 2. The Stranger Appears. Night still lay heavy over the lonely dirt road, the pale moon like a morning veil stretched across the sky. The wind hissed through broken fences, slipped into barren branches, groaning like the weary voice of a land long accustomed to watching lives buried beneath judgment. Maria Clara lay motionless by the abandoned post, her hair matted with blood and dust against her hollow cheek. Her eyes half closed, her breath faint and broken like an oil lamp, flickering before the wind snuffs it out. No lantern from town reached her, no shadow of help, only the cold breath of night and the dry, bitter scent of earth. Then from far away, another sound threaded into the silence. At first it was nothing more than the whisper of the land itself, but soon it grew clear, the sputter of an old motor wagon, the groan of wooden wheels grinding gravel, the faint rattle of metal shaken loose by the rough road. A wavering yellow light rose and fell in the darkness, appearing, vanishing, returning again with each rut in the path. A headlamp dim and dirty with dust pushing back only a small strip of the night. Yet even that fragile glow was like a spark carved into the cold. The driver was Pedro Henrique, a young farmhand who lived quietly on the far side of the valley. His hands were calloused from years of plowing and mending, his hair tousled by the endless wind of the fields. He was not a man to roam the roads after dark. To him, night was a time for sitting by the fire, listening to wood crackle, letting the day's labor slip away. But something unspoken had drawn him down this path tonight, as though fate itself had led the way. And it was the faint headlamp of his wagon that revealed a sight which struck his heart still. By the roadside, curled near the broken fence, lay a small figure. At first nothing but a shadow, but as the wagon drew closer, Pedro saw it was a woman. His chest tightened, his heartbeat turned heavy. He pressed the brake. The wagon shuddered and came to a halt. The old engine coughed, then died, leaving only the night, the wind, and the pounding in his chest. Pedro sat frozen for a moment, hands clenched on the wheel, eyes straining against the dim glow. He had seen animals left to die, had seen drunks strewn across the road, but never had he found a woman collapsed like this in the midnight dust. He stepped down his boots, crunching the gravel, each sound carrying like a warning in the silence. He moved slowly, his chest drawn tight with a strange fear that if he touched her, she might vanish like a dream. The headlamp's beam swept across her torn dress, showing the bloodstains spreading across her back. Pedro's throat closed. He had seen rope burn cattle hide, but never before had he seen the whip marks of such cruelty across a woman's flesh. His steps faltered as though bound by the injustice laid bare before him. He drew a deep breath and knelt. Her face came clear, ashen pale lips, cracked eyes half-lidded, hovering between life and death. His hand trembled as he reached forward, then stopped, afraid his roughness might cause more pain. His voice broke low against the wind. "Can you hear me?" In her haze, Maria Clara stirred. Her eyelids lifted just enough to reveal a blurred gaze wet with tears. A shadowed figure stood above her, haloed by weak yellow light. Terror rose in her, and she whispered, her voice fading, "Please, don't hurt me anymore." Pedro stepped back half a pace, his heart seizing. That plea was not meant for him, but for the world that had abandoned her. His hands tightened, then slowly eased. His voice softened, quiet as the wind. "No one will harm you now? Not while I'm here?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the scent of earth and faint wood smoke drifting from faraway hearths. Pedro shrugged off his heavy coat smelling of sweat and hay and laid it gently across her trembling body. The coarse fabric brushed her wounds and she flinched, but her breathing steadied as though shielded at last from the biting cold. He knelt closer, watching her face beneath the blur of lamplight, a face bruised, bloodied, yet fragile still. To him, she was more than a victim of a whipping. She was the very embodiment of all the injustices that had ground this land into weary souls. A force stirred in him stronger than fear, a responsibility he could not turn away from. His heart whispered louder than the wind. If he walked away, she would die here, forgotten. If he stayed, his life would change forever. Leaning near, his breath brushed her tangled hair. "My name is Pedro. I have a place nearby. If you let me help, I'll take you away from this road." Maria Clara did not answer, only blinked, a tear breaking loose at the corner of her eye. It was enough, a fragile sign of life, an unspoken yes. The wind rose, the moon slid free of its shroud, shining on the sight of a man kneeling beside a fallen woman in the heart of a lonely road. This time, Pedro did not hesitate. He laid his hand gently on her shoulder, then slid his arms beneath her slight frame. She moaned faintly, her breath quickening with pain, yet she did not resist. He lifted her carefully as though carrying a wounded bird and turned toward the wagon. Each step he took echoed with his pounding heart, mingled with the scrape of fabric, the howl of wind. The headlamp quivered, lighting their way, and within Pedro rose a strange and sacred fire, the sudden, undeniable call to protect. And in Maria Clara's shallow breaths he felt the fragile weight of trust being placed in him. That night fate had chosen them both, and the dirt road, once a place of silence and shadows, now bore witness to a beginning. Part 3. The coat. The moon still hovered in the sky, casting a thin silver light over the empty dirt road. The western wind raced on, lifting red dust into the air and brushing it across Maria Clara's pale face. She trembled in the arms of fate, her tear-blurred eyes blinking just enough to prove she was still alive. Pedro Henrique paused by the roadside, his rough hands shaking as he slipped out of the heavy coat that had carried him through so many winters. He draped it over her narrow shoulders, moving slowly as if a single strong gust might break this woman in two. When the fabric touched her wounded skin, Maria Clara flinched, but then her breathing eased. A small ribbon of warmth began to thread its way into her chilled body. Pedro felt the change as clearly as if the old coat carried not just heat, but a quiet promise beneath his shelter no one would harm her again. He knelt at the edge of the road, the faded yellow headlamp washing his face and hers, the two of them strangers suddenly set side by fate. Pedro slid his arms beneath Maria Clara's back. She was so light it startled him, as if he were lifting a shadow more fragile than a bird with a broken wing. Each time he rose with her in his arms, the wounds across her back drew a soft, sharp moan, small sounds that cut his heart like a blade. "I know, it hurts," he said, his voice low and rough, falling into the dark like a simple vow. "But I won't leave you here." A hard wind rushed through swirling red dust around them. For a moment their shadows stretched long across the ground, overlapping like proof of a bond just beginning. Maria Clara parted her cracked lips, her voice drifting. "Why? Are you doing this?" Pedro walked on in silence, breath steady. He was not a man of words, but the look in his eyes as he glanced down at her said everything, because he could not turn away. The worn-shouldered coat, heavy with smoke and sweat, felt to Maria Clara like the softest blanket in the world. Every shallow breath she drew carried the scent of earth, of old cloth, of safety. Her chest rested against Pedro's, and she heard the steady beat of his heart, the rhythm of a man used to silence now becoming a shelter for her. He carried her toward the old wagon, the headlamp still trembling as it lit the way. With each step, gravel crackled under his boots, woven with the wind's hiss and her quickened breaths. Above them, the clouds drifted, revealing a brighter patch of moon, as if the heavens themselves were quietly blessing the moment. Pedro set Maria Clara in the seat with care, as though placing down a precious thing. He pulled the coat snug around her and arranged a scrap of cloth from the wagon as a makeshift pillow. She closed her eyes, a tear rolling down her cheek, not in despair now, but in fragile relief. He stood still for a time, one hand resting on the seat's edge. He had never imagined his life could change in a single night. One choice, one road, one woman nearly frozen to death. Now, looking at her gathered small beneath his old coat, he understood he had stepped into a story that would not let him turn back. The world outside was still cold and black, but inside the wagon, warmth had begun to kindle. The moon lay across the empty road like a lost silver scarf. The western wind lashed on, tossing up red dust, and the rotting fence line groaned. Maria Clara lay still, breath broken in pieces, the lash marks on her back stinging with every rush of air. In the instant when death felt closest, the figure of a poor man appeared. With trembling hands, he unbuttoned his heavy coat rich with the smell of hearth smoke and fields, and laid it over her thin shoulders with slow, careful hands, as if afraid a firm touch might shatter her. The cloth brushed torn skin, and she shivered, yet the cold withdrew inch by inch, replaced by a tender warmth. Maria Clara opened her tired eyes and saw Pedro's sun-browned face ghosted in the sickly gold headlamp. Out of the fear that still clung to her, she rasped, "Please, don't hurt me anymore." The words cut deep, not aimed at him, but at a lifetime of shame. Pedro swallowed the tightness in his throat, his gaze softening. "No one will hurt you again," he said, his voice low as wind through a mountain pass, "not as long as I'm here." He bent down, slipped one arm beneath her back and the other under her knees. Maria Clara felt light as a broken feather, and the thought chilled him. A grown woman reduced to a shadow of herself. His arms trembled not from weight but from sorrow. She moaned faintly, lips dry and rigid, yet instead of pushing away, she let her body lean into his chest and listened to the strong, steady beat there. That rhythm in this moment was proof that life still moved around her. The wind rose in fitful gusts, but within Pedro's arms her tremors eased. The frayed coat became a thin wall between her and the night, a silent promise. Pedro's boots crunched over the gravel, the headlamp casting their doubled shadow long and close. The darkness witnessed a poor man quietly carrying a forsaken woman, as if all of fate were holding its breath inside this single moment. "Why are you doing this?" she murmured again, half dreaming. Pedro didn't answer right away. He was not a talker. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, headlamp trembling over stone and rut. Yet in the quiet, the answer was clear enough because he could not walk away. At last he said softly, "I've got a place not far. Tonight you'll be safe." The old wagon waited by the road, one wheel sunk into a shallow rut. Pedro stooped and settled her onto the seat, careful as a man setting down something sacred. He drew the coat over her, then fetched a worn cloth from the trunk to cradle her head. Her face blurred in the light, but her closed eyes no longer looked afraid. A tear fell, less a cry of despair than the soundless sigh of release. Pedro sat beside her, a hand resting on the seat as if to keep her from drifting away. He had never believed life could turn in a heartbeat. From a quiet farmhand at home with dry fields and thin cattle, he had become the shelter of a stranger. His heart, long schooled in silence, rose with a single simple command: protect. He looked at her dust-streaked face and knew that left alone she would die here, as so many forgotten lives had before. And if he stayed, his road would never be the same. Maria Clara stirred under the coat. Her lips trembled. "I won't be a burden, will I?" The question struck him dumb. He tightened his fingers on the seat and answered simply, voice firm as wood, "You're not a burden. Tonight all you have to do is live." Simple words, but to Maria Clara, they flared like a small fire in the cold. Pedro turned the key. The engine coughed and sputtered, then caught. The headlamp threw its beam farther, showing dust whipping through the air. The wheels rolled slow, carrying them off the lonely road. Wind scraped along the windows. Her breathing came heavy and uneven. Between them, another kind of silence spread, the quiet of trust just beginning. Maria Clara closed her eyes and pinched a fold of the coat in her fingers, as if holding on to the first warmth she'd felt in a long time. Pedro glanced over and saw her hand clench, and his heart softened. He remembered being 17 the night he lost his parents in a fire, sitting alone in the dark, wishing for a hand on his shoulder that never came. Tonight, fate had placed a different chance in his hands to be someone's shelter. He would not waste it. Outside, the night still ran cold and empty. Inside the rattling wagon, warmth began to spread. The old coat that had carried Pedro through many a winter storm now became Maria Clara's first roof against the night. And there, on that deserted road, a new journey began, the journey of two souls who thought they had nothing left now, by chance finding each other beneath a dim moon and a cutting wind. Part 4. A poor but safe home. Pedro's old wagon rattled and coughed as it climbed the dirt slope, its wheels crunching over loose stones, carrying two souls away from the fateful road. Night had deepened, the moon hanging dim as a torn cloth in the sky, spilling pale silver over the low hills. Maria Clara leaned her head against the seat, her breath ragged, her hand clutching Pedro's coat as though it were life itself. Each jolt of the wagon sent a tremor through her, yet the warmth of the fabric and the faint scent of sweat kept her wrapped in fragile safety. After half an hour, the hill opened into a small valley. Before them lay Esperança Pedro's little homestead, poor, yet enduring, built by his own hands from the ashes of the past. A wooden house of rough planks, its roof patched with broken tiles, a faint glow spilling from its single window. Smoke drifted thin from the chimney, carrying the smell of burning wood into the wind. From the porch, a small dog. Nina barked twice, then stopped as she recognized her master. Her tail wagged softly as if she too understood the weight of the stranger her master carried. Pedro lifted Maria Clara gently from the seat and crossed the gravel yard. The wind tugged at the bucket, swinging by the well, its creak a sorrowful tune. With his shoulder, he pushed open the door and brought her inside, where the smell of old wood and lingering ash greeted them. The room was plain, a scarred wooden table, a few crooked chairs, a narrow bed against the wall, and a wood stove still holding the embers of the evening's fire. Not rich, not abundant, but in this cold night, it was a true shelter. He laid Maria Clara on the straw mattress, pulled the coat over her shoulders. She opened her eyes, glimpsed the cracked ceiling, then closed them again, tears slipping free. For the first time since the whipping, she was not lying on the cold ground. That simple truth broke her heart open, and her tears carried a strange relief. Pedro went to the stove, adding dry wood until the fire snapped and crackled, pushing warmth into the room. He filled a pot with well water, set it on the flame, and when it boiled, he dropped in dried arnica leaves, an herb his mother had once taught him to use for bruises and pain after long days in the field. The bitter, sharp fragrance filled the cabin, mingling with wood smoke, bringing both comfort and memory. He returned to her side eyes, careful as he studied the marks across her back and arms. His rough hands moved with unusual gentleness, slow and steady as though afraid to cause her more pain. "It'll sting a little," he said softly, "but it will ease after." Maria Clara shut her eyes, lips trembling, and nodded faintly. When the damp cloth touched her wounds, she gasped, fingers gripping the bed frame. Pedro held his breath, waiting for the wave of pain to pass, then continued with tender patience. In the glow of the fire, the moment became a simple painting, a man bent in silence, tending the wounds of a woman the world had cast aside. His hands were not just soothing her skin, but stitching back a shred of trust into her soul. Maria Clara felt it, no desire, no pity, only kindness. When the poultice was finished, Pedro sat by her bed, pouring hot water into a chipped enamel cup. He lifted it toward her lips. "Drink a little. It'll help." She sipped the warm stream, sliding down her parched throat, and sobbed. "It's the first time someone's given me water after I fell." Her words broke softly. Pedro lowered his gaze, the fire painting his shadow on the wall, his face still and solemn though his eyes stirred. The cabin filled with the smell of herbs and burning wood, the snap of kindling echoing softly. Outside, the wind still howled, but within these walls, warmth settled in. Maria Clara lay still, hand clutching the coat, her eyes closed, listening to the clink of a spoon against the pot, the slow step of Pedro on the floorboards. Those small sounds, steady, tender, lulled her toward sleep. At last, a sleep without fear. In her dreams, childhood returned. She ran barefoot through cornfields, heard her father's laughter, saw her mother hanging white dresses on the line, the fabric billowing in the wind. The images were so clear, she smiled in her sleep. Then they faded, replaced by the sting in her back. She shivered, but the weight of the coat on her shoulders steadied her, and she sighed like a child beneath a familiar blanket. Pedro kept his place by the fire, his eyes never leaving her bed. The sharp smell of arnica brought back memories, his mother treating his father's wounds after a bull's charge, the same bitter fragrance filling their small house. To him, it had been a memory of loss. Now it became a bridge, a circle completed, caring for another soul, keeping it from fading. The night stretched long, but no longer as cold as the road. The wind still clawed at the eaves, yet the fire glowed bright and warm. Nina curled by the door, lifting her head at times to watch, then lying back down, guarding the stranger, as if she too had chosen her side. Pedro leaned against the wall, his eyes heavy but open. He knew that from tonight on, Esperança would no longer be the refuge of one man alone. It had become a shelter for two lives bound together by fate. Part 5. A meal and the fire's warmth. The fire in the wood stove crackled, casting flickering light across the wooden walls, patches of brightness and shadow rising and falling like waves. Outside, the wind still howled, but inside Pedro's small house at Esperança, the air had changed. Heat spread from the stove, chasing away the biting cold that clung to skin and bone. Pedro had kept watch almost the whole night. His deep eyes remained sharp, for he knew that what the woman lying there needed was not only medicine, she needed food, something to hold her to life. He stepped to the back of the house and took an old clay pot. Into it, he poured the last handfuls of broken rice, a pinch of salt, a few dried greens he had saved, and water from the well. The fire licked at the pot's bottom, and soon the simple warm scent of boiling rice began to rise. He stirred with a wooden spoon, the clink against the pot steady and calm. His mind slipped back to childhood when his mother would make this thin porridge whenever sickness came to the house. That humble smell had always meant tenderness, something he had long lost, and now he was cooking it again for a stranger. Maria Clara stirred faintly. The wounds on her back still burned, but the pain was softer now under the herbs. She opened her eyes and saw the firelight glinting off Pedro's figure bent patiently over the stove. That sight, broad shoulders, quiet hands devoted to stirring a pot of thin porridge, brought tears to her eyes. A poor man, a stranger, giving her a care her own husband had never offered. Her throat tightened, but for the first time in months her heart trembled, not from fear, but from the touch of simple kindness. Pedro ladled porridge into a rough earthen bowl and carried it to her side. He sat gently steadying the bowl. "Eat a little," he said, his voice low, warm. "Strength will return with the first bite." Maria Clara hesitated. From her cracked lips slipped a trembling question. "Why? Why are you doing this for me?" Pedro paused, his eyes still on the bowl. Then he answered slowly, "Because everyone needs someone who won't turn away." His words, few but weighty, fell into her heart like a small fire lit in the cold. He lifted her carefully, easing her upright. When the first spoon touched her lips, the warmth slid down her throat and tears blurred her eyes, not from pain, but from the taste so familiar. The thin rice gruel carried her back to childhood, to her mother's care, to poor meals brimming with love. Her tears dropped into the bowl, mingling with the porridge. Pedro saw but said nothing. He simply lifted another spoonful, offered it gently. "Take your time," he whispered. "No one here is in a hurry." The cabin filled with quiet, peaceful sounds, the snap of firewood, the clink of spoon against bowl, the steady breathing of two people who had just survived a storm. "Nina!" The little dog, curled by the door, snored softly, a steady rhythm beneath the silence. Firelight danced in Maria Clara's eyes, making them shine with something more than shadow. After a few spoonfuls, she asked softly, "Do you have a family?" Pedro shook his head, gaze lowered, voice as low as the wind. "No one left, only this place. And these hands." The words were few but carried the long weight of loneliness. Maria Clara was quiet, and in that silence she felt an invisible thread between them two souls once abandoned, each in their own way. Pedro set the bowl aside and let her lean back. He sat by the fire, his face still, his eyes reflecting the flame. After a moment she whispered, "I thought no one saw me as a person anymore." He turned his deep brown eyes, lit by the fire's glow. "I see you." Just 2 words, and they broke her. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. Outside, the wind still roared. But inside the poor little kitchen, with its flickering fire and a bowl of thin porridge, 2 people had found a moment of peace. For the first time in many months, Maria Clara no longer felt like the barren wife scorned and cast aside. She felt like a soul worthy of care. And Pedro, a man long accustomed to silence, felt his heart soften in the presence of another. In the warmth of the fire, in the humble taste of porridge, a new rhythm of life began, fragile, trembling, but enough to keep them side by side through the night, like 2 small lanterns burning against the storms of the west. Part 6. The past revealed night at Esperança was still as a pond, broken only by the steady chorus of crickets and the wind slipping long against the wooden walls. The sky glittered with silver stars, their soft light spilling over the poor little house, making it feel less alone. Inside, the fire in the stove had burned low, leaving only glowing embers crackling gently like whispers in the dark. Pedro sat by the half-open window, an old clay cup in his hand, his gaze turned upward to the star-filled sky. Maria Clara lay on the bed, her breathing steadier after the warm porridge, yet her eyes remained open, staring far away. She was silent for a long time, as though gathering courage from the stars above. Then her voice came trembling but clear. "Pedro, I must say this no matter how much shame it carries." He turned his expression soft and gave a small nod, waiting. Maria Clara swallowed hard, her fingers clutching the coat at her shoulders. "They call me barren. I could not give my husband a child, and for that I was made into a joke, beaten, despised, treated like a sinner." The words rushed out like an arrow long drawn, tears spilled, sliding down her thin cheeks, dropping onto the straw pillow. "I prayed, I drank every bitter medicine, I begged God for a child, but nothing came. I became a burden to the man who once swore to protect me. And then the whole town, they saw me only as a cursed shadow." Pedro said nothing. The crickets outside played on a quiet hymn to her release. He set his cup aside and moved to her bed. His face lay half in darkness, the red glow of the embers catching only the depth of his brown eyes. He did not rush to speak. He pulled a chair closer, close enough for her to feel the weight of his presence. "Maria," he said, voice low and steady, "the worth of a person is not measured by whether they bear a child. I know how deeply you've hurt, but the fault was never yours. The fault lies in the blind eyes of others." Maria Clara sobbed softly, covering her face with her hand. "You don't understand. I believed them. I thought I wasn't worth living." Pedro leaned nearer, his calloused hand resting on the bed's edge, close but not touching, letting his warmth reach her. "I understand more than you think. I lost my family in a fire. The whole town blamed me for it, though I never knew if I was at fault. People find the weakest shoulders to heap their anger on. I too once believed I had no worth. So yes." He drew a long breath. "I hear the weight in your voice because it is the same weight I once carried." Maria Clara turned her eyes toward him. His gaze met hers. No pity, no judgment, only understanding. Her chest tightened, but the heaviness was lighter than before. Beneath the stars and the song of crickets, two souls looked into each other and found the reflection of their own wounds. "Do you think," she whispered, halting, "that a woman like me could still deserve love?" Pedro did not hesitate. "There is no could or could not. You deserve it, because your heart still knows how to love, to endure, to dream. That is enough." Tears spilled harder, but a trembling smile touched her lips. The wind outside no longer sounded cruel. It was as if the whole land had sighed more gently. The night deepened, the sky opening wide until it made them feel small. The stars quivered like candles spread into a silver river overhead. Wind slipped through the walls with a faint cry, then dissolved into the valley's silence. The smell of wild grass mixed with the old scent of wood smoke, a fragrance both strange and familiar, like a memory without a name. Maria Clara clutched the coat tighter. The pain in her body she could bear. It was the words, the laughter, the scorn that cut deepest. Each morning's crow, each child's laugh in the market reminded her of what she lacked. Her voice thinned to a whisper. "There were nights I lay awake hearing the neighbor's baby cry for milk, and I cried too until morning, not for the child, but because I knew I would never hear such cries in my own house." Pedro sat still, his wide hand resting on his knee, fingers curling tight. He let her words fall one by one into the room. He did not break them with answers, for he knew that sometimes silence was the truest listening. Maria Clara closed her eyes and continued, "I tried everything. Medicine prayer, I knelt before the statue of the saint, swearing I would walk barefoot to church each dawn if only he would grant me a child, but in the end, only an empty cradle remained. My husband looked at it as though it were a betrayal, and I believed him. I wondered if I was even a woman anymore." The words struck the room like a stone on water. Pedro raised his eyes to the sky beyond the window, his brows drawn. In the reflection of the stars, his face bore the weight of her pain. At last he spoke, voice steady but full of feeling. "There are words people speak not to find truth, but to cast off their cowardice. A child does not make a wife's worth. If someone believes it does, then it is they who are lacking." Maria Clara went still, then gave a broken laugh through her tears. "So simple, yet no one ever said that to me." Pedro's fingers drummed lightly on the table's edge, his memories surfacing. "When my parents died in the fire, the town looked at me as though I'd lit the match. They said I was careless, that the lamp tipped because of me. I don't know the truth, but I carried that guilt for years. I lived like a man condemned, hiding from every gaze. People love to heap their burdens on those too weak to fight back. I know what it feels like to live under a sentence you did not choose." Maria Clara's eyes searched his and found something achingly familiar, not pity, but the deep understanding she had long craved. Her voice trembled. How did you live with that shadow?" Pedro hesitated, then gave a small, weary smile. "I learned to live quiet. The land didn't judge me. The horses and the dog never asked my past. I worked, planted, mended, until day by day I saw I still had worth elsewhere. But some nights under skies like this, I still wonder if I hadn't been there. Would my parents still be alive?" The confession weighted the air, but it built a bridge too. Two souls once certain they suffered alone now discovered each other in their scars. Maria Clara let her trembling hand press against the blanket, whispering, "So, I'm not the only one carrying an invisible sentence." Pedro tilted his head, his gaze soft. "We all carry scars, Maria. People see the ones on skin, but not the ones in the heart. But I see yours." Silence stretched. The crickets sang on their chorus a hymn of sympathy. The embers cracked in the stove, casting amber light across the walls. Maria Clara turned her face, hiding her tears, and let out a shaky laugh. "You speak so little, but each word feels carved in stone." Pedro shrugged, a faint smile, flickering, tired but true. Those who speak little only speak when they mean it. And so they sat, no more words needed. In the starry night, with crickets calling and embers glowing, empathy had woven a new cord between them. In the harsh land of the West, inside that poor little house of Boa Esperança, Two hearts had for the first time been fully heard, and in that listening a seed was sown more precious than any prayer. The seed of trust that even beneath the weight of judgment, two souls might still find each other through compassion. Part 7. A gentle twist. Night at Boa Esperança had quieted so deeply that the wind brushing through dry grass could be heard clearly. The moon hung high, its light gentle as a thin silk cloth laid over the yard. The sky shimmered with countless stars crowding together, tracing out the rough lines of the old wooden roof. Pedro stepped onto the porch, lantern in hand, its amber glow casting his long shadow across the dirt. Maria Clara, still weak, followed slowly behind, his worn coat draped around her shoulders. They sat side by side on the wooden step, silent, gazing up at the heavens, each seeking a corner of peace for words not yet spoken. Crickets sang their steady hymn, mingling with the soft stirrings of Nina, the little dog shifting in her straw bed. The scent of wood smoke lingered, twined with the damp fragrance of grass carried by the wind. Maria Clara sighed, her eyes set toward the dim outline of distant hills. All my life, she said, her voice no louder than the breeze, I have been looked at as an empty shadow, because I could not give a man the child he wanted. They said a woman who cannot bear life is nothing more than dry soil. Tears threatened, but she held them back. Pedro was quiet for a long time. In the moonlight, his face was half in shadow, half in silver glow, his deep brown eyes unreadable. Then he drew in a long breath as if gathering courage to open a door locked for years. "Maria," he said softly, speaking her name clearly for the first time without hesitation, "there is something I have never told anyone, something I have carried like a sentence since I was 17. She turned toward him, waiting. He did not look away. His rough hands rested on his knees, trembling faintly, yet his voice was steady. I cannot have children either." The words dropped heavy between them like a stone into still water. Maria Clara's eyes widened in shock. The wind rose through the tiles, whistling a long cry. Pedro lowered his head and gave a bitter, weary smile. "After the fire that took my parents, I fell ill with fever. Weeks of it. When I recovered, the doctor told me I would never father a child. I buried that truth inside me, afraid that if anyone knew I would lose all worth. Here a man is measured by the children running in his yard. I never had the chance." Maria Clara's heart clenched as though a hand had gripped it tight. She had not imagined that this man, the one who had lifted her from despair, bore the very wound she carried. But instead of shame, a wave of compassion rose in her chest. Her tears fell, not from humiliation, but from understanding. "How long have you lived alone with that secret?" she whispered. Pedro lifted his eyes to the stars. "More than 10 years? I never married, never promised anything. I could not tie a woman's life to the sorrow I carried, so I chose solitude. Better I bear it alone than bind someone else to it." Maria Clara's hand trembled as she clutched the edge of his coat. "Then, when you saw me, a woman cursed as barren, you recognized something familiar." Pedro nodded, his eyes glimmering with quiet sorrow. "Yes, I saw in your eyes the loneliness I had seen in my own reflection for years." In the hush, the crickets seemed louder, bearing witness to the truth now uncovered. Maria Clara wept freely, letting her tears fall. They slid onto Pedro's hand. He stilled, then slowly closed his hand over hers, holding gently. "You are not alone, Maria," he whispered, "and neither am I. Perhaps for the first time, I no longer carry this burden by myself." She looked at him, her eyes bright in the dark. "They said I was no longer a woman because I could not bear life. But now, hearing you, I finally understand. It is not the body that gives us worth, but the heart that loves." Pedro did not answer. He only nodded, the moonlight catching in his eyes. They sat together on the porch, two people with matching scars. In their shared silence, pain began to turn into a thread of connection. The night wind no longer cut cold. It sounded instead like the gentle sigh of the earth itself. That night, under the stars at Boa Esperança, two broken souls found each other in their rawest truth. And from that truth grew something fragile yet unyielding, faith that love is not measured by the children born of it, but by the way two hearts can save one another. Part 8. The Confrontation. The quiet night at Boa Esperança grew heavy, as if the whole sky had lowered itself onto the hill. The moon slipped behind dark clouds and shadows thickened across the land. Pedro had just closed the wooden door after speaking with Maria Clara on the porch when the sound of hooves broke the silence. At first scattered, then pounding, rushing like an iron storm charging nearer. Nina, the little dog, sprang up barking wildly, her fur bristling, her golden eyes fierce in the dark. Pedro's brow furrowed. His hand hovered over the old rifle hanging by the wall. He had no wish to use it, but he knew winds did not rise like this without reason. Maria Clara stepped from the house, her face pale. Her voice quivered. "It's him? I know it." Fear glimmered in her eyes. Pedro set a steady hand on her shoulder, his gaze fixed on the blackness near the gate. "Go back inside. Lock the door. Don't open it until I call." His voice was low, firm, like a wooden beam bracing against a storm. Then the glow of torches and lanterns wavered into sight, bobbing in the dark like restless spirits. Hooves struck the dry ground, raising dust that hung thick in the air. João Batista appeared first astride a tall horse, his face flushed with drink and hate. Behind him rode two heavy men, clubs in hand, shoulders broad as oxen. They stopped at the gate, their eyes sharp, predatory. Pedro Henrique Juan roared, his voice torn ragged by the wind. "Who do you think you are, hiding my wife? You want to steal my honor?" Pedro stood firm on the porch, his feet rooted like posts driven deep into the earth. He did not yield, only answered in his low, steady tone, "I've stolen nothing. I only saved a life from the death your hand delivered." João laughed, a dry, cutting laugh scraping like steel on stone. "Saved her. That woman is my shame. She gave me no child, and so she has no right to live. You shelter her, and you defy me." Inside the house, Maria Clara wept, her hands clutched to her chest. She longed to run to him, but she remembered his words and knew to step outside would be to pour oil on fire. Through a crack in the wood, she saw his back broad and steady, standing like a mountain against the dark. Pedro's hand closed on the rifle, but he left it leaning by the wall. He knew that once a shot was fired, blood would spill, and this night would never be washed clean. His voice was steady, heavy as stone. "João Batista, you have done enough. Tonight you may take my life, but you will never lay a hand on her again. Never." The words struck the night, and silence pressed down. The wind stilled. Only the harsh snort of horses and Nina's frantic barking filled the air. João's men gripped their clubs, tighter eyes flicking to him, awaiting the signal. João snarled, pointing toward Pedro, "Drag him down. Show him the price of defying me." The two men leapt from their saddles, boots pounding, clubs raised. Pedro stepped down from the porch, his face calm, though fire burned in his eyes. He spread his arms wide, planting himself before the door, as though to swear with his body to reach Maria Clara. They would first have to strike him down. Tension drew taut as a bowstring. Inside, Maria Clara trembled, but a truth flared in her chest. This was no longer a fight for one woman. It was a battle between two worlds, one of cruelty, pride, and violence, the other of protection, compassion, and love, unspoken. The lantern above the porch swung hard in the wind, its glow casting long, stretched shadows across the yard. The gate groaned under the gust, its hinges crying like a warning. Maria Clara pressed her forehead to the door, her fingers digging into the wooden beam that barred it. Every hoofbeat struck her heart like a hammer. Through the crack, she saw the torchlight carve twisted shapes on the ground, shadows that looked like demons gathering. Pedro stood alone, his figure dark against the pale moonlight. He knew he was only one man with an old rifle against three drunk with power, but his feet held firm, his back straight as a pillar. In his eyes there was no boast, no roar, only a quiet resolve the woman behind him would never be theirs again. João jerked his reins, his horse reared teeth, foaming, his face twisted with rage. He hurled his empty bottle to the ground. It shattered, glittering shards scattering in the moonlight. "Pedro," he bellowed, "you think a ragged farmhand can stand against me, against this whole town? Give her back, or I'll burn this pitiful place to the ground." Pedro did not answer at once. He heard Maria Clara's frightened breath through the thin wall. Then his voice rose, deep and steady, cutting through the night air. "There are things, João Batista, you cannot buy with gold or bind with whips. She is not something you own. She is a person." The henchmen exchanged a look, cruel smiles curling their lips, but in their eyes a flicker of doubt. They knew what had been done to Maria Clara, and some hidden part of them recoiled. João's face darkened, his voice cracked with fury. "You dare preach to me, you a man with no herd, no family, no son to bear your name? You think you're better than me?" The insult fell, but Pedro did not flinch. Years of scorn and blame rose inside him, not as shame but as strength. He stepped forward, voice slow, each word carved into the night. "I am not better than any man, but tonight I will not let a woman take another lash in the name of your pride." Behind the door, Maria Clara broke into sobs. Never before had anyone spoken of her this way. Never before had someone stood in danger to shield her. Her cries carried into the yard, fueling João's rage. He shouted, "Bring him down!" The two men charged, dust rising under their boots, torches flaring against scarred faces. Pedro's hand slipped from the rifle. He would not draw it. He clenched his fists ready to meet them with nothing but his body. Silence closed and thick as iron. Even the crickets hushed. Maria Clara pressed her brow to the cold wood, her lips trembling in prayer. Pedro stepped out fully before the gate. The moon caught on his frayed shirt, turning him into a wall of shadow and light. "If you want her," he said, his voice hard as oak, "you'll have to pass through me first." João laughed, harsh and bitter, echoing across the yard. Yet beneath it a pause so brief but real, for never before had anyone stood unshaken before him. Maria Clara sank to her knees behind the door, whispering through her tears, "Lord, keep him standing. Don't let him fall because of me." The night drew tight, every breath a pulled bowstring. The torches flickered in the wind, their flames nearly snuffed. The yard of Boa Esperança had become an arena where a poor man faced the arrogance and cruelty of one who had ruled the town by fear. And in that moment it was clear after this night none of their lives would ever return to what they had been. Part 9. The decision the night at Boa Esperança was thick like spilled ink spreading across the land. Wind lashed the wooden boards, making them creak and groan. At the gate torchlight flared, revealing Juan Batista's face red from drink, his eyes burning like coals while his 2 hired men gripped their clubs waiting for his word. Nina's long howl carried through the air, caught between barking and warning, a cry of dread for what was coming. Pedro stood tall on the porch, his shadow stretching long across the dirt, his broad back filling the doorway. His calloused hand trembled faintly, yet his gaze was steady, locked on João. He knew all he had left was his will, but that will stood firm as stone. Inside the cabin, Maria Clara pressed herself to the door, every word exchanged outside, striking her chest like a hammer. Her breath came fast, her ribs tight. Within her rose 2 warring tides, fear of João, the man who had made her life a prison, and the sight of Pedro's back, the man who had given her food, water, and the first fragile peace she had known. Her eyes swept the little house, the scarred wooden table, the stove glowing with embers, the frayed coat draped over her shoulders. It was poor, humble, but it was warm. She thought of the big house she had once lived in with red tiles and granaries full, yet inside only whips and insults. Here there was little, but it was filled with kindness. João's roar split the night. Maria Clara, come out, choose, return to my house, or let this ragged farmer die for you. The words rolled like thunder. Maria Clara's hand shook violently. She knew that if she went out and agreed, Pedro would be spared. She also knew that to return meant chains, forever more lashes, and the slow death of her soul. Tears welled, but this time they were not only of despair. Behind her fear, a new strength rose. All her life she had been forced to stay silent, to bow her head, but now seeing Pedro stand firm before the storm, she realized silence could be its own kind of sin. She slid the bar from the door. The hinges groaned as it opened, and Pedro turned sharply, alarm flashing in his eyes. "Get back inside," he barked, but Maria Clara shook her head and stepped onto the porch, her dress whipping in the wind. Tears streamed down her cheeks, yet she stood tall, her gaze fixed on João Batista. "I will not return, João," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "You may take my blood, you may strip away the honor this town thinks I had, but you no longer hold my soul. I choose to remain here, even poor, even in danger, for at least here I am seen as a human being." Nina barked harder as though to echo her words. The yard fell silent for a few heavy seconds. João's men faltered, their eyes wavering. Pedro, his eyes wet, gave the faintest nod, pride and sorrow swelling in his chest. João's face twisted with rage. He cracked his whip through the air, its hiss cutting the night. "You dare defy me, woman? You think your choice holds any weight?" Maria Clara stepped forward, now standing level with Pedro. She gripped his hand tightly. "My worth is no longer for you to define. I would rather die here than live as a shadow in your house." Pedro tightened his hand around hers, then turned to João. His voice was low but iron strong. "You heard her. She has chosen. Bring the whole town if you will, but you will never take her back again." Silence spread, heavy as stone. The wind sighed through the trees, bearing witness. João opened his mouth to shout, but then his eyes fell on their clasped hands on the fire burning in Maria Clara's gaze. For a flicker, his power faltered. The dominance he had wielded for years no longer reached her. Maria Clara lifted her chin, tears still falling, but her lips curved into a trembling smile. In that instant, she was reborn, not a beaten woman, but a free soul. And all who saw João, his men, and Pedro understood this was the choice that would change all their lives forever. Part 10. A Family of the Heart. Morning spread a pale golden cloth across the town, laying its light over old rooftops and dusty streets. The market was alive with chatter voices, calling laughter, echoing the smell of roasting coffee and corn cakes mingling with smoke from cured meat. Stalls brimmed with vegetables, grain, and cloth while people bargained, shouted, and laughed. São Bento do Cerrado, the town that had once watched Maria Clara fall beneath the whip, bustled as always. Yet the glances cast at her now had changed. No longer the pointing fingers, the cruel whispers. Instead, silence, a step aside, a small nod of respect. It was not full forgiveness, but it was an acknowledgement she had stepped out of the shadows. Pedro walked beside her, his rough, work-worn hand clasped around hers, a steady anchor. The townsfolk looked on with eyes that held curiosity, unease, even regret, but Pedro kept his stride calm and even silent, needing no defense before a crowd. The truth was already written in his heart. As they passed the stalls, a small sound reached Maria Clara's ears, a faint sob like the cry of a lost bird. She stopped tugging gently at Pedro's hand. In the corner of the market beside a discarded wooden crate sat a boy of 6 or 7. His hair was matted with dust, his eyes wide and wet with tears. His clothes were torn to rags, his bare feet black with dirt. In his hands he clutched a broken corn cake as if it were his only treasure. Maria Clara knelt her skirt, brushing the dust. "Child, why are you here alone?" Her voice was tender like a thread of silk. The boy lifted his frightened eyes, lips trembling. I have no home. My mother died. They told me to beg at the market." Behind her, Pedro's chest tightened. The sight of the boy pulled him back to his own 17th year alone after the fire, with no one left to lean on. He stepped forward, his broad hand settling gently on the child's shoulder. "What's your name, son Gabriel?" the boy whispered, hugging the broken cake to his chest. Maria Clara brushed the tears from Gabriel's cheeks, then looked to Pedro. In their eyes, the truth was already clear. She whispered, "Do you see God has sent us a family?" Pedro nodded slowly, his voice deep like a promise sworn. "From this day, you will never be alone again. Boa Esperança will be your home." Gabriel blinked, stunned. His small, trembling hands were lifted into Pedro's, then Maria Clara drew him into her embrace. The child burst into sobs, but woven into the crying was relief, like a bird returning to its nest after too many days adrift. Around them, the market grew still. Some whispered, others wiped their eyes. They had once turned away when Maria Clara was beaten, had once mocked Pedro in his solitude. But now, seeing these two broken souls reaching out to an orphan, their hearts stirred. An old woman sighed and shook her head. A mother drew her child close and whispered, "Look there, that is what a true family is." Hand in hand, Pedro, Maria Clara, and Gabriel left the marketplace. Their footsteps marked the red earth road back to Boa Esperança. Dust rose in the wind, but no longer as a sign of hardship. Now it was the curtain of a new beginning. When they reached the homestead, Nina ran bounding across the yard, barking with joy, circling the boy. Gabriel laughed aloud, a bright ringing sound that filled the poor little house with life it had not known for years. Pedro looked at Maria Clara, his eyes shimmering, his lips moving but silent. She answered with a radiant smile. That night, beneath the old wooden roof, 3 sat by the fire, Pedro stirring a pot of porridge, Maria Clara breaking cornbread into small pieces, and Gabriel eating with eager joy, his eyes alight. The fire popped and crackled, mingling with their laughter. Maria Clara leaned against Pedro's shoulder and whispered, "Do you see, I once believed I would never be a mother, but today my heart is full. Blood is not what makes a family, love is." Pedro squeezed her hand, warmth shining in his eyes. "And I am no longer alone. We have a family now, a family of the heart." Outside, the young moon rose, lighting Boa Esperança in silver. In the yard, Nina curled in the dust, guarding their sleep. The wind swept gently across the porch, not mournful, but singing a quiet blessing. And within the little house, 3 hearts that once knew loss now beat together, beginning a new journey of hope and a love made whole. Epilogue. Sunrise over Boa Esperança. Dawn spilled across the valley of Boa Esperança. From the east, the sun rose over the hills, its golden light stretching across the meadows, scattering pearls of dew across every blade of grass. The early wind carried the scent of damp earth, the faint smoke of fresh kindling, and the crow of a rooster ringing from afar like a hymn to the morning. In the red dust yard, Gabriel ran barefoot, his laughter bright and clear. Nina, the little dog, chased after him, her golden coat gleaming in the sun. On the porch, Maria Clara shaded her eyes against the new light, her smile soft and serene. A face once etched by suffering now glowed with the peace she had long believed forever lost. Pedro stepped out, his faded shirt stretched across broad shoulders. He slipped an arm gently around Maria Clara, and together they walked into the yard. Gabriel ran to them, his small hand clutching hers, then reaching for Pedro's. 3 figures, one large, one slender, one small, joined hand in hand, walking together into the morning. Childish laughter, Nina's eager barking, the rustle of the wind through the grass, and the crackle of firewood still burning inside, all blended into a song of new life. The house was still poor old timber walls, chipped tiles, the creak of the well's bucket, yet in that moment Boa Esperança was no longer lonely. It had become a home. Maria Clara looked to Pedro, her voice a whisper, "But certain family doesn't need blood, only hearts that know how to love." Pedro nodded, faith shining in his eyes. Gabriel's small hands squeezed theirs tightly, as though sealing the promise. Against the brightening sky, their 3 shadows stretched long and straight, moving forward together. A new family had begun, not from blood, but from love and the courage to rise above judgment. And for all who listen to this story, its truth remains in a harsh world. Compassion and love are the strongest shelter of all. If this story touched you, leave a comment, give it a rating from 0 to 10, and subscribe for more tales of healing and hope from the Wild West.